Welcome all to this session on MVIS security with OAuth feature. Here is the agenda of today's session. Security, overall what constitutes a security in the current world, especially in the software world. We want to cover a little bit of the higher aspects of it. Secondly, we're going to cover the various flavors of security provided in MVIS. The third point is more on the API security, which is authentication and authorization aspects of it. Fourth is the new way the applications are being developed, especially in the cloud format, but it's not restricted to cloud, is the OAuth. So we wanted to understand what OAuth is, why, how, and what use cases does it solve. Following with is the architecture of a system using OAuth, and in a demo application where we have configured MVIS with OAuth security aspect, and want to show you the way it can be used in your an application. So let me start in general the aspects of security. So for in software world, I think security has become the most important part of any application. So in this security context, there are three parts which I want to highlight. One is SSL, which is network level security. When the two systems are communicating to each other, they are using the SSL based protocol, SSL or TLS. Then there is another aspect of authentication. So we want to verify the person who is actually using the system is the one which he claims for. So that is covered under the authentication aspect. And once he has been authenticated, what he is allowed to do, and that is covered under authorization. So these are the three broad level aspects of security for any software being developed in the current times. So let me touch base first on the SSL in MVIS. So as you can see, MVIS acts as an integration server, which is allowing to expose multi-value data in the form of REST. One can expose also subroutines in MVIS. Now, from the security point of view, I have two points here. One is what we call as outbound SSL and an inbound SSL. So what do I mean by outbound SSL? So outbound SSL is any communication which is happening from MVIS to the outside world, and in this case the database has to be secured, and that feature is already there in 1.2 and in the 1.3 also. Then there is an inbound SSL, is like when your application is invoking a REST endpoints, it wants to communicate over HTTPS, and that's what I meant by the inbound SSL communication. So overall, the packets which are being transferred from the system or to the system are being secured in MVIS. Now, once we have secured the communication between the systems, now let's move to the part where a user authenticates to a system like MVIS. There are three types of authentication mechanisms available. One is basic, the other is digest, and the third is token based. So now with basic, what happens is the username and password are being encoded base 64 and being passed as an authorization header in the format of basic and the base 64 encoded string. And the receiving system decodes it, understands the username password if everything is the username and password are found in the receiving system. the user is authenticated. It's very simple, and it's one can use basic authentication, but there are pros and cons to this system. The one part is that the basic, in the case of basic, it is base 64 encoded. So once you have been able to get that header information, you are able to decode the username and password. So there are various means which one can tap into the authorization header. The slightly better secured way is the digest system, where apart from the username password, there is a concept of nonce which is being used, which is in a way being active for a limited amount of time, and that nonce is used to encrypt the username and password. There's an algorithm from using the hash and double hash, and then the information is being passed to the server. So it is still better than the basic authentication. The third part is the token-based authorization. So in this case, what we are passing is, in the authorization header, is the bearer followed by the token. Now, why do we all require these three ways of doing it? So one can understand that the basic is kind of possible, that it's a base 64 username password, but one can use the digest system for that, digest-based authentication. So why do we require token-based? The current development of applications is that with the digest one, the user needs, if you have multiple applications, you need to, again authenticate yourself for every application which you're visiting. So maybe you have an enterprise application and you want to, enter the username and password once, and all the applications are available to you. That is one case. Second is, what happens is, to prevent the user from authenticating it, that is where I think the token-based authorization comes in. As long as the receiving system has a token which is kind of vouching for that the user has been authenticated, the multiple applications can rely on it. Second part is that the current, with the microservices architecture, where in every service is itself, it has its own authentication mechanism, developing its own authentication mechanism is an overkill. So it will be very nice from the scalability, that if you have multiple applications, you have a centralized place where you authenticate yourself once, and once that is being done, that is being passed to it. That information is being captured and passed across different applications or different microservices. So there, the whole power of token-based authentication comes into picture. So whoever is having information in the authorization header has token, definitely has been authenticated, and will be able to access the services provided by the individual applications, or in this case services. So now, with that context of that we require a token-based authentication mechanism, it opens up multiple facets. So let's assume that you have a client application, you have one application which is using token-based, and another application B which is also using a token-based. But the structures of the tokens are a bit different. And in these applications we want to integrate. So what we need is a standardized token format. So that is one aspect which, under the ambit of OAuth, I would not say OAuth is the one which is providing. There are various token standards. It is called as JSON Web Token, and that is what as a standard has been, under the RFC has been described. The other part of it is that what we require is kind of an authorization framework. So having a framework of, in a way, that how a user or an application would be authenticated and authorized would help us to integrate to different systems and provide us the easiness that, hey, tomorrow I want my application to be authenticated using Gmail or another using as Facebook. It will not be a big problem for me. So what is OAuth in this case? So OAuth in this case is an open protocol to allow secure authorization in a simple and standard methods, especially for web, mobile, and desktop applications. So in order to understand OAuth flows, I would come to the topic of OAuth flows in few minutes. One needs to understand the various players and the terminologies which are being used in case of OAuth. So one is a client, which is like a trusted client. It means that you have an app installed in your mobile and you trust this app. So that is a trusted client which wants to access some resources. Then there is an untrusted client. So you go to a browser and you type in and go to a website. It's a web-based application. Then the second aspect is the authorization server. So the two parts to it is authorization server in this case allows you to delegate your authentication and authorization to that authorization server. So you don't need to have any mechanism of authenticating the users in your application. And I'll touch the part of authorization servers itself. What we call it as, there are services called as identity providers, are the ones which themselves are delegating to Google, social connections, or any kind of stuff. So there is a very flexible model where one can get its users authenticated through the authorization server. Then there is a component called as resource server, is the one which we say which are the services or resources which we are interested in. So I want to access the timesheet data of my employee, or I want to access my finance data. So that is the one which resources. These are the kind of resources which are being provided by the resource server. Then there is the resource owner, which are users, our users in this case, which are users of this application or are users of this client, and they want to access and own that resource. They are the ones who, they want to know about their finance data. They want to know about their bookings. So that's why it's called as resource owner in this case. So it's an actually user of the application. So these are the players which come into context. Now, in this case, what happens is, in case of OAuth, the trusted clients or an untrusted client, in the sense the web application registers with the authorization server and says like, hey, I am registering with you, and the authorization server gives kind of confirmation that, okay, if you're registered, this is the token, this is the client ID, and under which you are registered over here. The resource server in this case trusts the authorization server, and in the sense, and that trust in the form of is being established in the form of the that you have an access token with you. So I'll delve into the topic of access token trust in a little bit more in the coming up slides for you. So let me try to correlate how this thing would fit into the MVIS and your application in this context. So what you see is an identity provider, which is it can be Auth0, Okta, or your own identity provider. There are third-party libraries where you can have open source libraries where you can have your own authorization server. It may be totally within your need and not allow cloud-based services like Auth0 or Okta to be used. MVIS in this context of OAuth flow is acting as a resource server. So your application registers with an identity provider, and it provides to you a kind of a confirmation in the form of client ID. Okay, so that is typically a kind of a correlation between the OAuth players and into your how this will look like if you have MVIS and your application in play. So let's delve a little bit more into the aspects of this token. So now once we understood that the players which are involved in the OAuth flow, and it is a token-based authentication and authorization mechanism, which is obviously being standardized in the form of JSON web tokens. So the structure which you see, we have a header, we have a payload, and we have a signature. So I'll come to the topics of identity token and access token in a short while, but let me give you an overview of what this token sections and their importance means. So the first section in a token is a header section which says to you that, hey, I'm going to use an algorithm of RS-256, and I'm of a type, my token type is JWT format. So the structure, the data structure which you see is header, payload, and verify is a JSON web token format. Okay. The another middle section is the payload section, which is actually depending on in which context it is being used can vary, and more information I'll specify it in the coming time. So there's a payload section which is actually the main meat of the token, where you have a lot of information which can be used by the application to serve their purposes. And the third aspect is the signature. So one would understand is that, hey, anybody can, once they have a token, one can impersonate themselves, grab this token, understand their structure, and do it, right? And by the way, this structure or this token, what is being called is kind of an opaque. So when you go into the browser, you will be able to see this token clearly. Okay, it's base64 encoded, but once it has been, the whole structure is being base64 encoded. So header plus payload plus signature, it's divided into 3 sections, and every section is kind of base64 encoded. But as I said before, one can decode and one can understand it. So then the need of, tampering proof is required, and hence the signature comes into picture. So signature is just a hash of the header and the payload information which we have, and this signature is being encrypted using different algorithms. Okay, I'll hold this point of signature verification for now, but this is where the three sections are. Okay, now, so that if there is any tampering, one will be able to identify it. So one can have a symmetric key, in a sense, if you're seeing over here RS-256, it means it's a public key kind, public asymmetric signature verification, or one can have a symmetric verification, which is called as HS-256 also. And there are various algorithms a token can support. So mostly from the flexibility and maintenance point of view, the signatures are being encrypted once they have been hashed, is using the RS-256 public key infrastructure. This gives much more flexible. So the party which is creating this token encrypts it using their private key, and the party which is receiving it is decrypting it using the public key. So that gives you the context of the signature, and thus there is a validity, there is proof that the things are not being tampered. Now, once we understand the high level structure of this JSON web token, there are two token types. One is called as identity token and one is called as access token. So one would wonder why would require it. So yes, identity tokens are from what we also have a standard called as OIDC OpenID Connect standard, where the purpose is to identify the digital identity of the user. Okay, it is not about identifying what the user is allowed to do or not. It is about identifying whether, if I'm logging with Google, I am a Google user or not, and other purposes of it. So it's more of an establishing the identity of the user. What he's trying to say with the token, is he the real person for it? Okay. The access token is more on the related to the accessing of the resources from the resource server. So in our case, the most important aspect is the access token, which will be going further. So I just wanted to make it very clear that access token is the one mechanism which we are talking about. Now, if I go into the access tokens structure, there is an attribute being provided where you have called as scopes. So what a scopes essentially is, allows you to control in a way what this user is actually authorized, or what is which resources he is authorized to access for. So basically, scope here says in this example, I'm able to read a data resource and other aspects of it. So he's only able to access a resource which is being protected by an information like having a read data resource. So this is the concept of scopes. This allows you much more granular control of what the user is once he is being authenticated, what he is being authorized to do it, right? So I hope I'm making sense over here. So that is the part of the scope aspect. Then there is an expiry attribute, which is like, you don't want to have the, once somebody has an access token also and use it for, kind of impersonating or accessing resources which the user is not intending to do it or has locked out. So there's an expiry attribute which is being respected by the consuming system, in this case MVIS, that if the expiry has happened, this token is being rejected. So there is a kind of a time allocation or time element to this token. And these are all standard of JWT and OAuth specific ones. So nothing has been very specific for it from the MVIS point of view. What we have observed is also one can send scope as an array of scopes, in this case like read resource, but also some providers provide in a space form, space separated. So that flexibility is also part of the MVIS. So before we jump into the authorization flows, I just want to make sure that the signature verification algorithm which MVIS supports for signature verification is RSA type. So we use the asymmetric one, and I think that is the most used in the industry. So just want to say that this, we are not using HS256 but RSA256. So your token needs to be your signature of your token needs to be encrypted using a private key, and we will be decrypting the signature using the public key provided to us. So and I'll show you in the coming demo how does one inform MVIS about the certificate and the details around it. So there are 4 flows in OAuth, and I think each of them demands their own session to understand the intricacies involved and what are the parameters, what flows and everything. MVIS supports all the flows. The idea being that MVIS sits as a middleware and is behind your application. So any specific use cases of your application would demand you to go opt into one of the 4 flows. For MVIS, as it sits as a middleware, we would be more on the access control part of it and the validity of the access token. So authorization code flow is a typical use case would be that if you go to you create a web application and you want the users of it, whoever logs into it, to be authenticated by an external identity providers like Google or Facebook. So in this case, authorization code flow use case comes into picture. It is more of business to consumer kind of thing. Client credential is more from, and also as I call it, as machine to machine, wherein 2 systems are interacting with each other. One use case which we think is like if you have installed an app and that app is being considered by the user as a trusted app. So the app is acting as a client and is being registered to the auth server, and then the client is making request to the MVIS system. That would be, I think, would be the case of a client credential flow. The resource owner password grant is more of the user. The resource owner in this case, apart from the client, also enters his or her username and password along with it. So typically in case of an untrusted app, or beg your pardon, I think in case of you have your enterprise application, you have an app created, but it requires specifics of your of that particular user's details and everything, then I think the resource owner password grant flow comes into picture. So any resources which you want to access, which are not dependent on who logged in, can be part of a client credential. But if there are specific resources based on the user, then I think the resource owner password grant comes into picture. Then the implicit flow is again, we are passing in the username password with it. So I think it's mostly not being used. It's more of a trusted, so there is no possibility of interactions between the authorization server. So implicit flow comes into picture. So now we want to demonstrate to you an application which is kind of having a flow of authorization code flow. So what do I mean by that? Is like we're gonna have a an authorization server. We're gonna have a client, which is a custom app, and MVIS. All these three components in play, and I'm gonna show you a simple login flow. And if a particular resource is allowed, then you will be able to get the results displayed in the screen. So over to the demo.
Okay, so what do we have here is a sample applications created. One is authorization server. So we have used a Spring Boot based, but one can use for MVIS supports not only an Spring Boot based authorization server, but external authorization servers like Okta or Auth0, which we will try to show you in the next demo. So what we have is an authorization server, and then the second one is a client application which is running on 8443. So this is a typical scenario of your client application and authorization. So what do we have in MVIS to configure it for OAuth? So if you see over here in the configuration section, you have a new authentication type added, which is OAuth. One needs to provide an OAuth public key. So as I said, we support asymmetric infrastructure for signature verification. One needs to give a certificate which is in PKCS12 format. So I repeat, it's in PKCS12 format. So there are various commands or online help for converting a normal X509 certificate into a PKCS12 format. So let me grab the PKCS12 certificate for you. So what we have is a certificate created. So I'm going to use the PKCS12 certificate called as MVIS key store. So let me just copy it, name it as MVIS key store. And one needs to enter the password for it. So in my case, it's Tomcat. One needs to have the certificate or password required to open the certificate. So I just save the configuration. So once this has been done, I need to start the MVIS system. Before doing that, I just want to highlight you how I've managed to provide the scopes to it. So scopes in OAuth gets translated to roles in MVIS. So we take away the part where you don't even need to define users, and that's the beauty of OAuth, where you have your application's central users. You don't need to define one set of users in MVIS and other set of users for your application. All of them can be at one point, and whether these users are within your system or you're also delegating it using the external providers like Gmail or Facebook or anything like that. So what I have done is I have created a URL, so one can add a path. I'll just show you guys. I have went to the data resource. I have selected a customer, so one can select other data files over here. So once that is being done, what you can do is you can define a role called as read data resource. I'll come back to the part what it relations, but this is a scope which is being configured in the auth server and also part of the access token. So in this case, we have read data resource configured for all the get, post, and put. So now let me start the MVS. And in this way, you can configure your data resources for a particular scope. You can have multiple scopes added over here. So the point is, scopes in OAuth gets translated to roles in MVIS. So let me start the server. So once the server is started and running, and let me double check, the accounts are, the demo account is available. Now I want to go to the application, the client application which I've developed, and access a resource. So I've opened, let me open the application. So I've created an application which is a web-based application which I've seen running and accessible over. So it gets advanced, proceed to the unsafe, and I have a button over here as login with local auth server. So if I log in over here, it asks me for the admin, and I give a secret. What is happening is typically in OAuth case that you are saying that, hey, as a customer which you're logged in, or user which you have logged in, whether you're authorizing this application to access your protected resources. And if you say authorize, we are able to pull up the data of the get customers around it. So in that way, we want to show you out a simple application where you can access a protected resource and retrieve the data. So interesting part is the access token. So let me also show you that access token. So I have the access token with me. I go to the JWT.io site. I copy paste it, and if you see over here, I have the scope read data resources over there. So this has to be some of the as I highlighted before, some of them has to be an array of scopes, and others can be a space separated. So MVIS supports both format in this case. Another interesting thing is how do we use the Swagger for it. So once I have the access token, I can also go to the REST server, go to the demo application, access a custom resource. So now if you see this protected, so now I can, if I go over here and just say try it out and execute it, it says to me, hey, token required to access the resource 4041, it is unauthorized, forbidden request. So now we have the facility to also understand the access token. You have to type in bearer over here, say authorize, close it, and let me give it a one more try. I hit on the execute, and now you're able to access it. So the MVIS Swagger interface also now supports the OAuth authorization in this case. So I hope this gave you an idea how you can create a simple application where you can have an authorization server and a client application which is just logging with the local auth server, provide the scopes and get authorized by the local auth server, and then use the same access token to retrieve the protected resources.
So that being said, the context, I wanted to use this session just to give you an overall idea about it, and then we will follow up with another session where we'll show the live demo of both the applications. One is with using authorization code flow and another with the client credential. So I hope this session was informative, and now we can open up for the Q&A.